Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, and thank you for being here for our discussion with our esteemed panelists on navigating discredit and disbelief. My name is Joseph Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement at Drake University. For those of you who were in this room earlier, one of our other colleagues from the Race Center was also here, and we're happy to be participants in this great summit the last couple of days. The Harkin Institute's role really is to be a public policy think tank. So my job on a day-to-day basis with my colleagues is to do research and disseminate information through policy events and publications and social media and ways that we can connect people with public policy. But the way public policy is made is through, of course, the discourse in the arena of politics. And that is sometimes a place that is not quite civil. And so we really try to promote citizen engagement and try to promote civil conversations amongst citizens, but also amongst elected officials, public policymakers, politicos, as we call them, people who work within the business. So we're gaining an understanding of people's beliefs and values, and also the surrounding topics that we talk about every day are impacted by our daily lives and the lives of our background and history. And so we try to encourage people to have conversations to get to know individuals before they engage them in talking about public policy or engage them in sensitive subjects. Today's topic of discussion is going to be on the origin of misinformation and evolution of distrust and how the media, marketers, and others can regain trust amongst all types of audience. And you have three outstanding panelists who are going to talk to you about their perspective as we look at this from different angles and then have a dialogue about this particular subject matter. And we'll open it up to you after the four of us have talked a little bit, and we'll want to get your experiences and hear from you and be a part of this discussion as well. Aleksander Dardeli is going to be our first speaker. He is Executive Vice President for Strategy and Development at IREX. It's a global development education organization in IREX. It works globally and focusing on areas of cultivating leaders, empowering youth, strengthening institutions, and increasing access to adequate education. Our second speaker will be Chuck Kaiser, who's the General Manager of Edelman, U.S. Public Affairs, which designs campaigns to help clients succeed online and offline in the media across the globe. And then Sandy Pudar, last but not least, is the Assistant News Director at WGN Chicago, which I think goes without explaining what WGN is to the audience here, but a news outlet there in Chicago where we've seen several of those great shows and coverage over the years. We've had a conversation a little bit about what happens in the world as people start to filter and find information. How do they want to get their news? How do they want to get their information? Where do they find the things that they can rely on? And that took me back to an experience I had the very first time that I realized that all the information that I'd gotten may not have been correct. I was 12 or 13 years old, and I was on an exchange program, and I was in Ukraine. I was in my classroom in the Ukraine, in Armyansk, and I was sitting through a history class, and I was learning all about how the Soviet Union won World War II. I'd never heard such an argument before. But what it did for me as a young man was to open up my mind to think about perspective and to think about the information that comes back to us is edited, it's sometimes watered down, it's very much filtered. And this was in a classroom setting where you would think you'd get more information. But it was really interesting to me to then take that and go out and try to pull in more information. And that's how I gather information now, wanting to triangulate, if you will, and bring in as many sources of data as I can. And as a young policy staffer working in U.S. Senate, I wanted my information that I provided my boss to be the best, most well-triangulated information I could find. So I would search media sources. I would search out to the different agencies to give me good briefings and updates. And I would watch the entire range of news and read an entire range of news every day to make sure that I knew what our constituents were thinking. But I remember sitting in one particular committee hearing, it was a rough, long day, and I get home and I watch my news. I would start my morning with Fox News, I'd end my day with MSNBC, and I'd read Al Jazeera and listen to BBC in the middle of the day. And I was watching the show, and they were explaining something that had happened that day, and I thought, even one of the sources that I would normally trust, no, that's not right. I was there. That's not what happened at all. And so it made me, again, think about this sort of this situation that we put everyone in on a daily basis, where information's flowing at us pretty quickly, and we don't know how to best judge what is real, what is not, or what's a half-truth, and we need to search out for more. And so we've had this kind of conversation amongst the panelists and I think where we're going to start is to talk about the origins of misinformation and where some of those things might come from and how that develops over time and what effects that might have. And so Aleksander's going to start us off with that conversation.
Thank you, Joseph. Great to be here with all of you. I'm Aleksander Dardeli. So let me just start with one fact. Today, indeed every day, you know the greatest repository of information in the US? It is the Library of Congress. It has millions of books, DVDs, tons of gigabytes of data out there, film, video, conversations, NPR stories, your publications, your news stories are stored in the Library of Congress. Every day, the world produces information that is worth 250,000 Libraries of Congress. Think of that figure, 250,000 Libraries of Congress. So, my friends in the news media, if you think you're generating this, you're very wrong. You're generating a very, very small piece of this vast universe of information. Most of it is junk, actually, created by me, you, social media, other creators of content, the aggregators, disseminators of content. A lot of it is consumer logs. Some of it is actually good news content. A lot of it is disinformation, which is basically malicious information intentionally meant to mislead or to lead someone to a wrong belief or action. I'll try to move back and forth in time because I think it frames the conversation better this way. Have you ever heard of a book called, it's a mouthful, bear with me, Malleus Maleficarum? It translates into Hammer of Witches. Too bad. It's been one of the most popular books of all time. It went through 35 editions, and it led to massive witch hunts in Europe between 1400 and 1700. Hundreds of people died. It was one of the most successful disinformation campaigns made possible by this great invention called the printing press. It made it into a book, actually. Let me accelerate a bit, come to 1933. Nazi Germany creates the Reich Ministry of Public, I love this word, Enlightenment and Propaganda. And it had three main priorities and objectives: to promote racial superiority of the Germans, the Aryans, to promote anti-Semitism, and to mobilize the Germans for war. And you may think that all of this disinformation happened in Europe, in Germany, against the Russians and East Europeans and West Europeans, but it actually came here. It was quite widespread in the US, and it drove several points. President Roosevelt was a warmonger, and indeed, he was not even American. He was Jewish. His real name was Rosenfeld. War in Russia and Poland, the massive strikes against Russia and Poland were the effect of England's policies. And when they did not succeed to discredit Roosevelt, they blamed the US press for being a warmonger press, for instigating war, actually, for dragging the US into World War II. And there were quite a few Americans that basically became active participants in these disinformation campaigns. Charles Lindbergh is famous for participating in them. The so-called German-American Bund, which was a league of Americans with ethnic roots in Germany. But the undisputed grandmasters of deceit and malicious disinformation have always been the Soviets. So the KGB in 1923, very early on, created a thing called the Black Propaganda Department, which used the word dezinformacja, which now we know was created by who else but Joseph Stalin himself, actually. And he on purpose used a Western-sounding word to make it look as if it came from France, but was then, Russianized in translation. And they included them in a program called Active Measures, basically the use of information for warlike purposes, to accomplish warlike goals. And there's many examples of successful Soviet disinformation campaigns. Perhaps the most successful one is the case of the Holodomor, which is one man-made famine in Ukraine, and which led to the deaths of up to, it's believed, 7 million people. It was successful because the West actually never knew about it, indeed believed it never happened. And some pretty famous journalists, including from the New York Times, participated in this disinformation campaign. A second example is the so-called Operation Infection. Operation Infection was a KGB operation that tried to make HIV be portrayed in the rest of the world as a creation of the CIA, as a man-made virus to spread, disease in poor parts of the world. And by this, they try to basically drive wedges between the US and the rest of the world, and US and its allies. And this one was not that successful. But think now, let's come to the present, actually. We have nothing in this country, and in most countries of the world, that spend millions of dollars on spreading disinformation. That is not the case in Russia, actually. Estimates range between $1 billion to $6 billion annually to promote disinformation campaigns. And they are no longer the let's hide the Holodomor or Operation Infection, very crude disinformation campaigns. They are slick, they are sophisticated, they are well made. If you actually watch them on the news, they're quite appealing because they actually include parts of truth, parts of actually untruth, things that they want you to believe, and things that really confuse you. And they are conducted by Sputnik News, a well-oiled Russian machine, Kremlin-controlled machine, Russia Today, which is actually available in this country too, and you can watch it actually in many parts of the world, and the famous internet troll farms. Let me give you some worrisome figures. Facebook recently said that 126 million people have seen content from disinformation campaigns, Kremlin-controlled or other government or other entity-controlled. In 2008, there was a war in Georgia between Russia and the government of Georgia. Russia successfully hacked into government accounts of the Georgian army, actually, and used disinformation stories to manipulate the people of Georgia. In 2014, funny you mentioned Ukraine. So there was a part of Ukraine called Crimea, sort of the size of Connecticut. Suddenly, almost overnight, it became part of Russia. It was annexed by Russia. So you had one independent country that was attacked by another country, and it lost its territory. And it was done by little green men that Russia didn't know. And they actually trained Russian soldiers that appear in different uniforms in Ukraine. And they spread so much disinformation that Ukrainians were actually confused. They didn't know whether the Ukrainians wanted to join Russia or stay with Ukraine. So in this sense, it was quite successful. And then the same thing happened with the doomed Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, actually shot over eastern Ukraine. Waves of disinformation were spread over the web, and some of them were successful in confusing the public. In 2017, there was an election in Spain. It was illegal, held by a regional entity called Catalonia. They wanted to secede from Spain. Russia saw this as an opportunity. The Russian government saw this as an opportunity to sow discord in a member of the European Union. And what they did, they spread thousands of stories in the Spanish and other presses and basically made the Spanish government look bad, disliked by its own people, as a way of fomenting discord. 2017, French presidential elections, actually. We know that Russia hacked into thousands of accounts to support the opponent of President Macron, Le Pen, a right-wing politician in France, as a way, again, of fomenting discord in France. But let's come to the present, actually. Have any of you heard of her name, Alicia Hernan? She has a Twitter account at Alicia Hernan 3. she keeps tweeting against President Trump, actually. Indeed, on March 16, she directed a tweet to a Hawaii congressman trying to discredit President Trump. We now know, actually, there was a picture associated with the account, a blonde lady with glasses and a turtleneck. So we now know that this is a so-called sock puppet. The sock puppet is basically a fake account controlled by the internet troll farms, typically somewhere near St. Petersburg, Russia. And initially we thought that, this is another, hacked account, a fake account created by the Russian government. Well, we were wrong, actually. This was a sock puppet created by the Iranian government, which we now find has 7,000 phony accounts over social media in the US. So if you think that only Russia belonged to the disinformation club, it would be wrong, actually. The club is proliferating. China, with even vaster capabilities than Russia, is a member of this club. Iran is a member of this club. Saudi Arabia is a member of this club. Israel sometimes uses disinformation campaign. United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. So think of those 250,000 libraries of Congress of information and how much malfeasance and bad can happen through disinformation. So I'll stop there.
So if you're turning to me for a more uplifting narrative, I probably have a little bit to thread, but actually, to no surprise, given we're all gathered here, it's time for serious conversations around how disinformation, which certainly is the surround sound that we all must kind of sift our way through, that amid that and the distrust that it breeds, that there are seams of opportunity for you as communications, media, and practitioners and general citizens can see your way through to. So Chuck Kaiser here, and I am with Edelman, and for the past nearly 2 decades, we have studied the concept of trust. Our initial interest in the notion of trust began back in 2001. Many of you will recall what was then named the World Trade Organization gathering in Seattle, which became renamed the Battle in Seattle, where NGOs descended upon the city and basically brought the meeting to its knees, leading to its ultimate virtual cancellation. Instead of looking at it as a bunch of non-government organization zealots just with no message, our CEO, Richard Edelman, said, this is something that we need to cue into and pay attention to. So we began to audit trust in the 4 major institutions that we believe are trust drivers: non-governmental organizations, government, business, and media. And so for the past couple of decades, we've tracked the concept of trust and the concept of the broader population and their trust in these major trust-driving institutions. And if there's one thing that I guess, S.E. Cupp, I know many of you were able to see her speak last night, conservative commentator from CNN, but one of the things that she said, which I thought was the perfect setup for today, was that trust is the roots for thinking, and is the trust is the roots for the availability and the ability to have civil communication. And thus I'll draw upon some of the key findings of the study that we've been conducting for the last couple of decades, and it's across 27 countries, so it's not just a U.S. lens that I place over this data, and the parallels on a country-by-country basis are pretty powerful. Just to paint the picture, NGOs, who have historically always been the most trusted institution, have now rescinded and reached equilibrium with business as the most trusted institution at around 56%. And then government and media lag behind in terms of overall trust. But there's 4 key headlines that I'll share, and then there's a doorstop of data that I could direct you to at edelman.com if you need any if you want to replace your evening reading or not needing to use Ambien this evening or something like that. You can read our trust parameter data. But the two publics that form our general population are, number one, the informed population and the mass population. Informed publics having higher levels of education, income, and political activity and media consumption. And right now, it is basically a story of a yawning gap of two stakeholder groups, whereby there is a historic division between the trust levels of informed publics with the major four institutions I just referenced versus the mass public. 16-point yawning gap, which equals our largest deficit in history. And while informed public trust levels have increased significantly since 2012, the mass population has not really benefited from that improved outlook. So we're seeing this continuing yawning and drawing gap between the informed publics, i.e. the haves, and the mass public of the have-lesses. So that's kind of one of the major takeaways that we've seen from the trust barometer is we're living in an era in a disparity of trust. So that's point one. Point two is this feeling of uncertainty and pessimism is not limited to America. It is clearly not. People are not optimistic about the outlook of their futures, especially in the developed world. And in 14 of 27 markets that we survey, the mass population that does not believe that they and their families would be better off in 5 years' time. In fact, in nearly all developed markets, even the informed public doesn't feel quite as confident about the future. Second point. And that creates, again, an environment of unbridled distrust, fear of losing the jobs to automation, et cetera, are all palpable. There's, however, again, this is where things turn that will be pretty positive for folks like Dan and Sandy, is there has been a reappraisal of the age of the disengaged. For the past several years, we have seen a significant drop in the level and interest of media consumption. This year, there was a staggering increase in media consumption and interest, a profound shift. In 2018, 1 in 2 were not engaging with the news on a weekly basis, and today disengagement has fallen just over 1 or 4. And so we take a lot of heart from the reinitiation of individuals to kind of come out and seek the truth. Trust in traditional and search media are at all-time highs. This is one that we, I'll be honest with you, at Edelman, we predicted a continued steady decline in traditional media and its following and consumption and belief. Trust was basically formed by, page 1 of Google search, where people have begun to believe that Google is actually a news entity, and page 1 is the page 1 A1 page, top of the fold. But by contrast, social media continues to face major trust hurdles, especially in Europe, Canada, and the U.S., where the gap between mainstream media and social media is as high as 40 points in some markets. So concerns around fake news and data privacy continue to cloud the media ecosystem. And again, disinformation, per Alexander's point, can come in many forms. It turns out that, we learned last year through the writings of a unfortunate rogue reporter for Der Spiegel that fake news is actually real. The ironic headline came out, and that doesn't do any of us in the communications industry, whether we're teaching, whether we're proctoring, or whether we're reporting. That doesn't do any of us any good. Final major point is where you go to work every day, according to our data, is your last harbor of trust. And at a time when no institution is fully trusted, people are turning to that which is close to them, local and personal, which is really on a contiguous basis, their relationship with their employer. People feel invested in the employer and employee relationship because it's the one that's tangible and it's passed on and connected to on a daily basis. Nearly 6 in 10 employees look to their employer to be a trustworthy source of information on topics where there is disagreement and controversy. It is no longer enough for an employer to quietly operate in the recesses and take a a mezzanine seat when issues of social consequence rise up. And so we, as part of our trade as communications practitioners at Edelman, call upon the private sector to step up and lean into issues versus retreating and leaving it for government, NGOs, or the media alone to sort out. So again, as I mentioned, at Edelman.com, there is a plethora of results that could literally put the room to sleep here about, but those are 4 of the major thematics that have kind of risen to the top and gained the most traction in this latest edition, and appreciate your time and attention. Sandy?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sandy. I am the Assistant News Director at WGN TV in Chicago. WGN produces 12 and a half hours of news every day, which means every day I have 12 and a half hours in which I could possibly misinform you. And that is literally terrifying. I'm sad to say that on occasion we have had to issue corrections. We've also had to apologize for making serious errors in our reporting. I often have my friends and family ask me, how is that possible? I mean, there's so many of you. There's hundreds in the newsroom. You and your news director, Jen, you're so smart. How does this happen? It happens all too easily. And I have a great example that I just happened to stumble upon today. David Begnow, who was one of our colleagues and was a panelist today, was sent to the Bahamas on assignment, so he wasn't able to join us today. But he was reporting on Facebook, and I happened to watch one of his Facebook feed interviews with a woman who was in a desperate situation. She just wanted to share her story, and so David said, let's talk. And so she's crying. She was okay. Her family was okay. They lost the roof of their home. Their home was completely flooded out. She left her husband behind with one son. She was taking a daughter to try to find a doctor. She was in a state of disbelief, disrepair. I mean, your heart bled for this woman. You could see how much pain she was in. He started to ask her, about the experience of living through such a hurricane. And she said, she's describing things about her home. And she said, it's terrible. Dead bodies are just floating by. It was heart-wrenching. And he said, I'm sorry, did you just say you saw dead bodies float by you? And she said, well, I didn't, but I heard that there were dead bodies floating by. And he said, okay, thank you. She continued on with her story, and she said, and it's just unbelievable. Now there's a cholera outbreak. Can you imagine? What's going to happen to my children? And he said, I'm going to stop you one more time. I'm sorry. So who told you that there's a cholera outbreak? Did you speak with a doctor? Well, no, my uncle mentioned that there was a cholera outbreak. And he said, okay, well, CBS News has not verified that, so, let's continue on. And she said, and lastly, at my grocery store, they are housing, dead bodies in the coolers. And she said, I can't even believe it. I can't, David once again stopped her and said, so now, were you at the grocery store? Did you see that they were housing dead bodies in the cooler? Well, no, but I've heard that in the neighborhood. So what a gifted reporter to, in this time of emotional need in which I would have been sucked down that vortex of all of these stories that she's telling me. Why wouldn't I believe her? She's there, she's living it. And he stopped her very gently and carefully and asked her to clarify. She was not boots on the ground. She didn't have expert testimony to back what she was hearing. So how easily would that information have spread? And I would have told my friend and I've told my mom that, here's what's happening in the Bahamas. All 3 of those stories may very well be true. I don't know yet. And that's what a journalist has to do, is to stop and ask questions and verify everything that you're hearing, even when emotions take over. So once, I stopped that feed and I just thought, well, that's my story for today for all of you. It can happen very easily if you're not careful. My own personal experience here I'll share with you was the worst day at my career at WGN, and it's also the day that I offered my resignation to my news director, which thankfully he did not accept. But I was in the control room. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and we got word that a small plane had crashed on a major intersection in the Chicagoland area. Hard to imagine. We immediately sent up our helicopter to go fly over the scene to see what is going on. We were getting calls from viewers saying, oh my gosh, there's a plane. What? Sure enough, we get there within minutes, and there is an upside down crashed plane. Chicago police, Chicago fire are on the scene. People are milling about. It looks very active. It is not making sense to me. I'm seeing what I'm seeing, but why are the skaters not going off? This doesn't make sense to me. So as I'm on the phone with my assignment desk trying to gather more information, my producer thinks this is the greatest thing he's ever seen, so he puts it on TV. And my anchors start, describing what they're seeing. This is, Martin Luther King Drive in Chicago. The small plane has gone down, and I'm on the phone, and why are we on the air? I don't understand. I still don't understand what I'm seeing. What I see is real, right? I mean, I see this is happening, but why haven't the police, called us back? And it's all happening so fast. But I'm telling all of Chicago this is happening until we verify that it was filming a movie and this was part of a set, and that residents in the area were not aware that they are going to be filming this scene with such obvious clarity. So I just reported a fake plane crash. So as soon as my news director got in, I went straight to his office before anybody else could tell him, my error, and offered my resignation. I got a yelling at, and we had to go through some protocol changes after that. But misinformation happens. It's dangerous, and it is our responsibility as journalists to stop, to ask questions, and to completely verify, the age-old adage, if your mother tells you that she loves you, can you have 3 sources to verify that? I told that to my mom once, and she thought that was hilarious, but it's true. The question of trust always comes up. Why should anyone trust the media anymore? I would hope that people are still curious enough to want to know what's happening in the news. I would hope that the selection that you make is a source that you trust. It's getting harder, though. The whole industry changed 10 years ago with the evolution of the iPhone. Here was this device that you could hold in your hands that could open your eyes to the world. And instead, what I fear is that it's actually put us in a box. And so now you can very carefully decide what you want to see and what you want to hear based on your beliefs. And that's dangerous. It is exhausting to have to go through the BBC, the New York Times, MSNBC, Fox, CNN, to see the same story 5 different ways, told 5 different ways. But I think that's the point where we're at right now. Journalism has become very personalized, and to some extent, that is nice to be able to commune with people of like minds, but at the same time, you have to broaden out your mind. You have to understand the bigger picture. You have to understand that there are more people in the world than just you and I. So how do we as a newsroom respond to that is really you have to surround yourself with diversity. Our newsroom has changed so much in the 20 years that I've been there, and I'm so proud to say that I'm surrounded by so many people that I respect and admire who I have nothing in common with. And it's great because we have conversations that open my eyes. I was in an editorial meeting a couple of years ago, and we got a couple of calls from some neighbors on the north side who were extremely upset with Chicago because they're installing these new LED fancy streetlights that were keeping them up at night because they were so bright and it was so obnoxious, and people were really upset about this. And we all thought, oh, that's kind of an interesting, good story. And it was pitched, by a white male in his 40s who had been taking the calls, and he's like, I agree, man, this is just obnoxious. And an African-American woman from the south side of Chicago said, give me all of those lights in my neighborhood. I will take them because I'm scared to walk to my car. You make the street as bright as you like, I'll take them. And I thought, wow, we could have framed the story in one way, and there's a completely opposite way that we should actually be taking into consideration. Will these streetlights come to the south side of Chicago? Will it make a difference? Folks on the north side don't like them. So there's always an opportunity to really educate yourself if you surround yourself with different voices, whether it be cultural, religious, economic. It's amazing what you can learn if you stop and ask questions. My favorite story, and it's not favorite, but we were doing a first day of school story a couple of years ago, and we could have just done the story about it's the first day, kids have their new backpacks, aren't they cute? And instead, we happened to talk to a teacher who said that he hoped to make a difference after having lunch with a couple of his students. And so we said, what do you mean? And then we framed the whole story from his point of view. He's a new teacher in the public school system, very excited. He was in a rough area of the neighborhood and decided rather than having lunch with the teachers in the teacher's lounge, he's going to have lunch in the cafeteria with the students. And he sat down and he opened his lunch and he's all excited and, spreading out his lunch. And the little first grader next to him said, oh, what is that? And he said, what do you mean, what is that? And he said, what's that red thing? And he said, well, these are strawberries. And the boy's like, oh, I've never seen them before. And so where are we in our educational system? In these neighborhoods where children don't have fresh fruit, where are we as a city? What are we offering each other? And so we could have just done the run-of-the-mill, story about, cute kids going back to school, but we actually focused on these children and, the challenges they're facing can be as simple as they don't have grocery stores in their neighborhood. So it's just interesting when you stop and look around and ask questions, how easily you can find new stories. But at the same time, if you don't ask enough questions, you can accidentally lead to misinformation, which is the danger of our jobs and our absolute responsibility to be mindful of.
Well, I appreciate all of that, and Alexander for setting the stage, and Chuck taking us through where the data tells us that we are, and Sandy, you talking about the local media. And when Sandy hosted me at WGN, I was just kind of fascinated by just how it was like being inside the control tower of an aircraft carrier. I mean, there's a lot of things going on there, and you're just moving things throughout the day, constantly kind of waiting for the next thing. Tell me a little bit about, I want to continue a little bit of your conversation just now, the role of local news in developing trust. What do you see your responsibility in that?
Trust is being boots on the ground. You can't ask for trust if you're not with the community. So you have to be everywhere. I mean, my news director and I go to many a function, and folks ask us all the time, why do you go to so many dinners and community events? And it's because I want to make connections. I want to meet people. I want to find stories I would otherwise not find. Your community, our tagline at WGN is Chicago's very own. So we want to represent the city of Chicago as best as we can. We want to be your hometown station. To be your hometown station, we need to be in your backyard. We need to be with you when times are tough. When times are good, though, we need to send a camera as well. We went to a back-to-school event actually last weekend. We shot it. A lot of people came out, and we ended up not running the story in the news that night. And I mean, our phones lit up, and everyone is asking us, why did you not run the story? Is it because we're a poor Southside community? Like, why did you bother to send the camera? And the producer just said, I just didn't have time on my show. Well, they noticed. They really noticed. And so I had to explain to them that my producer decided that, they weren't worth 25 seconds. That stinks. I mean, it was a tough conversation, and we got a lot of phone calls and a lot of emails. That neighborhood, banded together and said, what the heck, WGN? Like, we want to see ourselves in your eyes. And so trust really comes at the very basic level of being in the community, showing the community, and advocating for them.
Well, and you told me that there's, the communities are reflected within the newsroom. And do you feel pretty confident about that for every place that you cover inside the city itself?
I don't feel confident that, that's something that we're growing on every day. We recently, a couple of years ago, hired a producer who is Muslim, and it was the first Muslim person I think that I'd worked with at WGN. And she came to me and asked, what our plans were to cover Ramadan. I had no plans at that point to cover Ramadan. It wasn't on my radar. So thankfully she put it on my radar and said, I have 4 ideas. I would like to, feature 4 Muslims who are doing, well in the city of Chicago, and, what they've done and what Ramadan means to them. And I said, thank you. Let's do it. You need to surround yourself with people who are going to open your eyes to what the city is, the fabric of the city. And that doesn't just happen because I don't know everything about everything, that's for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and Chuck, your trust barometer is really fascinating. And the study itself, you do have a chance to go out and look at it. There's an executive summary to the larger study as well, so you can have a little bit shorter reading and sifting through. But talk to me a little bit about what the business world has done, or have they done anything to embrace kind of their role now as one of those places where people go for trusted information?
So, apropos to the private sector and what the private sector has done whole cloth, if I were to put it in terms of a marathon, we would probably put it somewhere in the 4 to 5 mile mark, where there are some pretty powerful and visible leaders that have embraced the need to not wait for somebody else to lead from the front. And fair disclosure, some of these are clients. Paul Pullman, the now retired CEO of Unilever, who really ahead of the rest of the marketplace of large-scale manufacturers and producers got the nature that he needed to institute and inculcate a bold move towards sustainability, their usage of plastics, how they run their operations, their supply chain. Individuals like him and his vision are unfortunately too far and few between. And while there are there are countless companies that are giving of great levels of time, talent, and treasure, the new environment now calls for pretty bold moves to start a broader movement to create that brush fire. So We try to encourage our private sector clients to borrow the phrase from my CEO, raise their head above the parapet and take a stand on issues. And you've seen some additional evidence of that with the likes of Salesforce and other companies making business decisions based upon social policy. Well, if you're not going to, in your state, enact and support forward-thinking and forward-leaning LGBT rights, well, we're just not going to situate our regional development center there. So it's coming down to more than just philosophical decisions. These philosophical, ideological decisions are turning into dollars and cents, decisions.
Is there any pairing or working together between the four major entities that you see in terms of trust?
There, and we do try to engender anytime we can find cross-functional partnerships. Look, great partnerships, great public-private partnerships are forged every day to get the real work done, the construction of highways and bridges, and so I wouldn't want to single out any one over another that would work better than another, but there's still many more miles to go where both the public and private sector can work together and inform it by the mind of the non-governmental organizations, and with appraisal for how the media will assess an intake, an action. So I think it's still very much the front end of the journey in terms of that cross collaboration. Because frankly, it's just oftentimes just a lot easier to go it alone. You go quicker alone, but further together, is I guess the phrase that many more private sector companies need to embrace in pulling together the public sector and NGOs and media.
Sure. Aleksander, you set the stage pretty grimly, letting us know what was happening in the world, but particularly giving us that history, which I appreciate understanding and knowing. How do you help people to identify misinformation?
So I'm actually optimistic about the future and what we do with disinformation. I do have to say that I think disinformation is one of the great challenges of our time. And it's going to take some resources to deal with it, and it's going to take many solutions to deal with it. And I don't think there is a magic bullet. So we're here with the news media professionals actually. Clearly, better things need to be done by the news media. But these changes are incremental. Why are we here? And maybe we start with the problem, actually. So what's the problem? Declining trust in the news media, one, and the rise of state actors and non-state actors that use information for malicious purposes, disinformation. So what gave rise to these two situations? First is the collapse of the traditional model of the business of the media, actually. Advertisement fueled the business. Most of the advertisement today is captured by the big internet platforms. They outweigh anything that you capture in terms of revenue. So that model has collapsed, one. Two, you have the advent of the internet. It has depressed dramatically all the costs of production, and it has increased dramatically the speed and velocity of producing content, infinitely, actually. And then you have the rise of malicious actors, like ISIS, the Kremlin, or oligarchs, very rich individuals who use information for malicious purposes. What do we do about this? Frankly, a lot of the focus has been on the supply side. Better quality news, better standards actually in the news media, but we haven't really focused on the consumption side. Frankly, I think one of the speakers in the previous panels talked about personal responsibility. So I think we should take this a step farther. It's not simply about personal responsibility. It is the start of that, but frankly, there's a long tradition of libertarianism and personal responsibility in American history. And it has worked, but it has only and always worked if it has been coupled with an enabling infrastructure, institutions that made success possible. What do I mean by this, actually? So we need to work with consumers to build lifelong critical information consumption skills. In the 20th century, the education system used to be about privileged access to content. You wanted to become a doctor? You went to med school. You hung out with doctors. You had access to textbooks. Actually, you saw their clinical practice. You became a doctor after taking exams and so on and so forth. Well, now, you want to find about a medical procedure? Start with the Wikipedia. it's a pretty good start. There's plenty of content that is free access online. So the education system has to be repurposed. It's not about access to education. It's about information consumption as a survival skill for the 21st century. Think of our kids. We're giving them iPads and iPhones, and they access everything despite the controls that we put on them, actually. And guess what? They're unprepared to deal with this universe of junk, misinformation, disinformation, or good content. So we need an infrastructure to deal with this. And what is the infrastructure? The education system, actually. So we need to start early. We need to teach, actually, kids. It's a version of critical thinking, but it's more oriented towards information. Lifelong critical consumption skills in the realm of information. We have something to show for this, actually. At IREX, you mentioned Ukraine. It's funny because actually they've been at the forefront. In fact, they've been a lab of all of these disinformation campaigns out there. And so because they've had to deal with the problems, they've also developed solutions, actually. And some of the solutions there are pretty cutting edge, and we can actually learn from them here in this country. In Ukraine, we worked with a group, a targeted group, actually, of consumers of information. We started first seeing how do they consume information, how do they get the information, and then how do they make decisions on the basis of that information. This is actually very important. And we found out that you make individual decisions and they are impossible to penetrate, but you also make decisions on the basis of community institutions. The church, the soccer club, the pub, the bar, the school association, they help you make the decisions. So we found leaders in these institutions that basically were connectors and affirmers of information and the value of information, and we trained these individuals in developing, for lack of a better term, media literacy skills, but it was more broadly information literacy skills. We went a year later to measure the results, and they are available on our website, irex.org. We had some very interesting findings. We had a group of 200 participants in our training and 200 non-participants in our training, and we gave them fake news, disinformation pieces, emotionally charged content that could lead them to bad behavior. And we tested both groups. And we found some interesting things. First, the group that we trained had a 20% higher understanding of the media industry. They knew who's behind the media institution, who controls it, whether they have an agenda. And most importantly, they had a 13% higher ability to detect disinformation. This sounds like nothing, 13%, but in the world of statistics is huge, actually. And let me make it real. Couple it with your decision in an election. If you have a 13% ability higher than the rest to detect disinformation or junk and make an adequate and proper decision, you could dictate the outcome of an election that way. If you're in Eastern Ukraine, you make life or death choices every day on the basis of where you go, because you can actually be bombed or shot at or run into hostile folks. Well, that's a life or death outcome right there. And if you talk about Ebola and pandemics, actually, and using proper information, that's again, the outcome could be life and death. So I think I'm optimistic because if we focus on the consumption side, on the demand side, we will have better solutions. The second stage of this thing that we're doing in Ukraine right now is we're working with 600 high schools. We're actually disassembling their textbooks and reassembling them with critical consumption skills. 6 textbooks, actually. History, literature, social sciences, things like that. And we're testing the results with some initial data that is quite interesting. The ability to detect this information goes way higher. And for those of you who are interested in education, the interest in the subject is double, actually. Kids are interested in learning and learn better that way. So that's my ray of hope.
Sandy,
I
do you have something to say?
could build on that very quickly. Insofar as it becoming our responsibility as individuals to sort and compare news, which is an unwieldy task, and information in general, I'll raise my hand on behalf of the communications industry and the communications consulting industry that we see it as our significant ethical responsibility to partner with Nancy and her peers in the media environment to ensure that we are a first line of defense in terms of reprocessing and sharing clear, concise, and transparent fact with Nancy, because Nancy and their media peers are having to cover 3 and 4 and 5 beats with the same amount of hours in the day and a diminishing news cycle. So we see it as a tremendous responsibility to be both as fully disclosed as we can be within the lines of the law, as well as to be transparent, which is to be, you can share a lot of disclosure but not be transparent. So we in the communications industry see ourselves as having to partner with the media, even more importantly, to be extremely careful about what we share. The interesting point that you'd referenced about Wikipedia, Alexander, is I think it's actually a pretty darn powerful model of self-policing. Back to the point around ethic, our clients come to us sometimes and say, I don't like how I'm described in Wikipedia. Can you change that? And first we ask, well, okay, what is not factual? And usually that stops about 90% of the conversations. But for those other conversations where there is perhaps some misinterpretation of fact, the governance process of Wikipedia is so very thorough and checks and balances and smooth that it's just it is such a powerful instrument that I know you made it an anecdotal reference, but I actually believe there's some pretty powerful takeaways in terms of the crowdsourced nature of fact gathering by Wikipedia that has a real solid checks and balances system, and that has us regularly recusing ourselves from trying to massage any form of the truth with Wikipedia. And so back to over to you, Nancy. Sorry.
I'm good.
Sandy, anything?
Can I add something?
Sure.
So let me just share with you another interesting data point. I think between 10 to 20 years, most of the information in the world will be created by artificial intelligence. That's perhaps a great frontier, and a good horizon, but a bit scary at the same time. And if you look at it from this perspective, I don't see, and this is another part of the solution, how we can address this problem without bringing to the table the internet platforms. So they promised a revolution, they delivered a little bit, they also opened the floodgate of disinformation. And so I don't see how they can escape sensible regulation of some sort. I'm not talking about dramatic regulation, but some sensible regulation. You can't actually benefit from the revenue on the clicks and the ads and have thousands of fake accounts that instigate hatred, sometimes violence, and then claim ignorance about them, actually. And they've done a lot of good. They've generated immense wealth. There are some attendant consequences, and we need to resolve those consequences. So I think part of the solution has to be artificial intelligence to make it easier before we come to the individual human critical consumption skills.
Sandy, in terms of talking about those individual skills, how would you best describe or help a consumer to understand what they should be looking for when it comes to what is trustworthy media output?
It's confusing because times are now blurred between what is news versus what is opinion. And so often when I hear from viewers who are upset with us, it's because they're not hearing what they want to hear from us. If A plus B equals C, and I stick with C, and they say, no, it's really D, and I can't convince them it's really C, then they go somewhere else who's going to tell them that it's D. So it's hard, right? I mean, I was talking to some students yesterday and checking in with them as to what was on their news feed, and it's very tailored to what interests them. So it is better to have a diverse platform of ideas to sift through, and to each to their own to decide where they land, as opposed to where they're going to get their information from. Do your homework if you can. It is a lot to ask of people these days. You can't just rely on one channel anymore. I hope that we represent your one-stop shop in Chicago. I think that's the effort, is to present the news without bias, and to also try to the lens through which we always tell our stories is, how does it affect you, the viewer at home? If it's a national story, what are the Chicago implications? So we try to at least personalize it in that regard, so that you might trust that we have your back. We're going to present it through the lens of Chicago and the suburbs and how it might affect you. But if you don't have the appetite for that kind of information, I can't convince you otherwise.
So before we open it up to the audience, do you have any questions for each other?
Good.
Okay. If I can have a microphone, I can come out to the audience. Who has a question for our panelists?
Well, all it takes is one.
One brave soul. Yes, sir. Here, come your way.
Two-part question for each of you. First, quickly, where each of you get your trusted news, and second, assuming all of us fall into the category of informed news consumers, what would you tell us to do to try and convince those mass news consumers of where they should be looking and who they should be trusting?
My newsfeed is crazy. So if I'm out with my family and they see my phone start to light up, they don't understand. I'm getting pushes from everybody. I want to see how everyone is, disseminating information. So I have local pushes, national pushes, international pushes. But I'm a sucker for news. It's what I love. My very best friend, someone I consider a sister, doesn't watch my channel. Doesn't really care to be bothered with news of the day. Checks in when she feels like it, but it's frustrating for me to be, such close ties with my best friend, and she's not a news consumer, because it's what I live and breathe. So, but it's good for me to have her as a friend because she helps me disconnect as well, right? It can't always be about the news. It can't always be about, the story. You have to actually live a little bit outside. You have some experiences that you can take back to the newsroom, she tells me, which is good. So if you look at my phone, you would laugh at how many news apps I have. And where should people be looking? I think I've said it before, everywhere.
Actually, that's a really good question. I start off my day with my side. My wife watches the GN Morning News and toggles between that and Today's Show. Sorry.
That's okay.
And I get my broad exposure kind of crowd surfing news that way, and then I have to go through a daily progression with Financial Times, Guardian, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. And again, sorry if I'm missing any of your publications out there. And I mostly check the company listings just to see if many of my clients are in the news. I just spin through them and read them just to make sure I'm still an old guard print person in a digital era. And then, once I get through that, I dive into more vertical media for the interests of my clients. And then typically at the end of the day, I'll just read my Google feed and want to see how my alma mater is doing, who's both has my admiration and as a client too. So it's that's the natural progression. And then you wake up and you start over and do it every day. And I think the second question was, how do you recommend others digest their news? I have yet to see, and I welcome any suggestions from the peanut gallery, if there is one true consolidated feed that can really capture all of what's interesting and compelling to you, but I don't know if that's truly been created that you get one perfect dashboard of all the news that's most important to you, or that's most important, period, full stop. So I don't know that I could make that recommendation yet, but I'm sure someone's working on a solution for that. Aleksander?
So I start with a very quick read of the headlines, actually, and then it's not perfect. And I pick 2 or 3 or 4 that are of interest to me. And I typically explore a bit further through the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, The Guardian, sometimes Le Monde Diplomatique, that's a French publication that is published in English too, just for different perspective. And even further, I frankly prefer a bit the not newsy publications, the more in-depth publications, the stories of The Atlantic, The New Yorker, some other actually that have more time and attention and space to an issue to give more depth. To your point as to what to read, frankly, they reveal somewhat my prejudice, and we all have prejudice and biases to the publications I mentioned. It's not what to read. Frankly, you'll be far more credible in advising friends and colleagues and people who listen to you how to read, actually. So if you say Financial Times, well, that basically reflects your prejudice. That person's prejudice may be very different. But if you tell them, are there verifiable sources? Are these sources actually trustworthy? Is there emotionally charged content? Are you being misled through visuals or code words in the story? Do you know who owns this publication? Do they have actually a view? Is this advertorial content? Is it paid through advertisement? Is it opinion? or news, I think you'll be far more credible in conveying that line.
Terry, do you have a question?
I've been absolutely awestruck on, you mentioned it and the place before mentioned in that the safe haven to be able to have civility conversation is at work. And I can't figure out whether that's because you've developed relationships and you feel comfortable talking, or it's because it's the military chain of command that you know you've got to believe what your body, when something's decided at work, you've got to follow that. But can you reconcile that at all of why that's different than your home where your mom and dad are trying to protect you and give you the information you should know that you trust?
So I don't think anything replaces, your definition of family unit in terms of the comfort of discourse, but among the four institutions in terms of trust about one's embrace of the issues, it's obviously, it's very tied to the economic contract and the belief that I kind of have nowhere else to go at this stage to kind of seek out some form of ballast, and and thus conversely, the employer is becoming some form of a surrogate family whereby there's a look back to the employer to figure out what's going on socially because there's just so much swirl going on, disinformation or genuine information. So we're kind of seeing a more of a familiar environment with individuals and their employers, and frankly, it's a bit of a generational thing too, where we do see with separate client data that we seek out younger employees expecting more of their employers in terms of taking a stance. And you've seen the Google walkouts and these other major flashpoint incidences that when I came into the workforce, I couldn't even fathom something like that happening in such an arresting way over social principle. We've always seen strikes and labor negotiation over fair wages and whatnot, but the propensity and the visibility of it in the digital era is it's pretty staggering. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but we're just seeing this more familial phenomenon between employees and their companies, where there's both this reliance as well as this testing of their mettle.
So I was intrigued by that too, that data point, that actually the businesses seems to be a place of trust and civility. And frankly, anything that helps build civility in our lives and trust in our lives is welcome. That's quite welcome news. I just want to say something that, much as this is welcome news, I don't think, so this lack of trust and declining trust in the news media is part of a larger malaise. It's the larger malaise of lack of trust in our public institutions, actually. And so there's many manifestations of this, from populism to lack of participation in elections to many things, actually. And there's many reasons for this. And this is a very complex phenomenon. But because we lack trust and we have declining trust in public institutions, in Ukraine, actually, that's 9%. I think it's the lowest in the world, and I'm quoting your indicators, actually. It's horrendous. That shouldn't confuse us. Businesses can do some things and can do them quite well. They can't do some things, and they can't act collectively on behalf of organized societies. Government does that, public institution does that, and so we shouldn't lose trust in government. We should actually look at making that better, not ditching it. I would argue that what Google does or Amazon does, actually, we have almost zero say over that. But every 2 years we vote for a congressman. Every 4 years we vote for a president. We have some say, no matter how small that say is, over the public institutions. And some of the things we're talking about require infrastructure, public goods at work. Businesses can do some of that, actually. And their role is welcome, and the more they do, the better off we are. But there are some parts that they can't do, and we have to look elsewhere for that.
Other questions? Well, I think we're almost out of time, but what can you tell us about what can be done to regain trust? Is there any specific steps that you can think of that either as individuals or as institutions that can be done to bridge that gap between the consumer and the entity that's providing the information?
Well, if you use the trust barometer as a baseline, it would suggest that again, NGOs have generally engendered the highest level of trust, but in terms of public reliance, they're not viewed as having the scale on the metal to drive significant seismic global change. So NGOs, I think, need to reach out with a message and a mission across to the private sector versus being approached by the private sector and government to be an advisor and be a true catalyst and to try to do so at scale, particularly when you're thinking about environmental issues like water scarcity and climate change. This is where, instead of trumpeting, they can start to adhere groups together for solutions, all three other groups, because they're kind of a bit of an arbiter for all of them. In terms of the media, well, I'll turn it over to Nancy in terms of what the prescription would be for the media to raise trust. But there is one little interesting stat, and within the macro numbers around trust, there are still spikes and lagging trust for media. There are still these spikes of trust swings and positive trust swings from which to build. We did an election time or survey, pre-election survey for the midterms last year, and the percentage trust among the different trust in the institutions by the informed and mass public had some pretty big swings among them. And so let me do a little quiz here, show of hands. Who was more trusted, or NGOs was more trusted by either Democrat or Republican voters? Show of hands for Democrats. Show of hands for Republicans. No, Democrats led that. So Democrats trust NGOs more than Republicans. Who trusted business more, Republicans or Democrats? Republicans, show of hands. Okay, and then Democrats? Okay, so that's pretty expected, and Republicans far exceeded Democrats in trust. Who trusted government more at the midterms, Republicans or Democratic-leaning individuals? Show of hands for Republicans. Show of hands for Democrats. So I saw more for Democrats, but actually Republicans outpaced trust by Democrats by 10 points. And here's the last one. Who was more trusting in the media at the midterms? Democratic voters or Republican voters? Show of hand for Democratic voters. Yeah. And then show of hand for Republicans. There was a more than twice, nearly more than double the amount trusting for Democratic voters, which represents, according to our elections, at least half the populace. So there's at least half the population that is placing a lot of trust in the media. I think perhaps it's a precursor to how the media can try to find balance and that a nearly impossible attempt to thread the balance in how the reporting is viewed, but. There is it's not as if all audiences distrust the media.
I think we all know, if you choose to watch, the cable network of your choice, you know what bias they're coming from. So I think what SC Cup mentioned last night, and I'd like to just reiterate, is give your local news stations some support and some love. And they're the ones who are the boots on the ground, really telling stories that need to be told and are trying to get attention, and they're protecting your community. And they do filter out a lot of the noise that you might get elsewhere. And so, give your local news a chance once in a while, and you'd be pleasantly surprised, I hope, to see the kind of storytelling and facts that they're gathering that, personally affect you and your family. And you can always go for the entertainment at the cable stations. That's always going to be there. But local news is where it's at. I'm going to say that.
There you go, good point.
One of the most interesting findings that was mentioned in the keynote address this morning was that I believe the key driver of incivility and distrust is actually the use of social media and the time we spend with social media. It drives people to loneliness and distrust and incivility. And I believe actually it's not only this poll that shows that. There is a lot of research that basically supports this conclusion. So I'd say if we want actual long-term sustainable results, let's start very early with young generations in school, de-emphasize social media, build stronger senses of community and human-to-human connection. So instead of giving them iPads and iPhones and saying, search this information and find info about that, let's have them work together first, actually. Emphasize other things. And frankly, We invest massive resources in this country. You know, the per capita, per pupil expenditures are staggering compared to most of the world, actually. Let's reorient some of that towards community building, civility.
Wow. Well, thank you all. You've given us a lot to think about. Would you join me in thanking our panelists? Hope you all have a great rest of the summit. Feel free to come up and chat with any of our panelists.